Mist and silence hang over the northern sea. The faint outline of a longship drifts through the fog, its carved dragon prow staring lifelessly toward the horizon. No flames light its deck. No songs echo across the waves. In the Viking world, this was unthinkable. A king's death was supposed to blaze across the night sky, his ship aflame, his body sent to the gods in fire and smoke. Yet somewhere in the cold waters of the north, a Viking king had vanished, without pyre, without funeral, without closure. That is where our story begins, with a funeral that never happened, and a king whose death became one of the great enigmas of the Viking Age. His name was Olaf Tryggvason, warrior, conqueror, and missionary king of Norway. To some, he was the sword of God, the man who brought the light of Christianity to a pagan land. To others, he was a fanatic who burned temples, drowned priests, and shattered the old order. But no matter which story you believe, his death, and the mysterious absence of his body, became something greater than history. It became legend. To understand why Olaf's forgotten funeral mattered, we must first understand what death meant to the Vikings. For them, dying was not an ending. It was a crossing. The ship was more than a vessel, it was the bridge between worlds. Warriors believed that those who died bravely would be carried to Valhalla, the Hall of Odin, where they would feast and fight forever until the final battle of Ragnarok. But there were conditions. A man who died in fear or whose body was lost to the sea might be denied entry. The funeral rites, the burning ship, the gifts, the songs, were not mere traditions, they were the key to eternity. To die without them was to wander, restless, between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Norse sagas describe elaborate rituals. The dead were laid with their weapons, rings, and food for the afterlife. Slaves and animals were sacrificed to accompany them. The pyre was lit so that smoke could carry their spirit upward to the gods. The wealthier the man, the greater the blaze, because in this culture, honor was measured in how you were remembered. Kings and jarls sought funerals that would immortalize them, turning death itself into a final act of glory. But Olaf Tryggvason, the man who once commanded all of Norway, received none of these rights. His death, like his reign, defied every rule. According to some accounts, he fell in battle against overwhelming odds. Others insist he survived and lived on in secret. Either way, no funeral ship ever burned for him. The last image we have of him is a figure leaping from his ship into the sea, swallowed by the waves. For the Vikings, this was a terrifying thought. A king's soul adrift, denied passage, untethered from both Valhalla and Christ's heaven. In this opening mystery lies the heart of our story. How did a man who ruled with divine certainty end his life in such uncertainty? What political and spiritual forces conspired to erase his final ritual? And why did the people of Norway, who once sang his praises, choose silence instead of a song? The forgotten funeral of Olaf Tryggvason was not just the death of a king, it was the death of an age. His unlit pyre symbolized a world caught between two faiths, the fading fire of the old gods and the cold dawn of a new one. The Vikings who once burned their dead beneath the stars now faced a foreign promise of resurrection, a heaven without ships or swords. In that tension, between flame and faith, memory and myth, Olaf's story begins. As the sea mist closes in, the voice of the narrator softens. Somewhere beneath those gray waves, a legend sleeps. Some say he waits for the day when Norway will need him again, when his ship will rise from the depths and the fire that never burned will finally be lit. Whether that day will come is uncertain. But one truth remains, every king deserves a funeral, and the one denied his became immortal. The story of Olaf Tryggvason does not begin with a crown or a throne. It begins with exile. He was born around the year 963, during one of the darkest and most chaotic times in Norway's history. His father, Tryggve Olafsson, was a petty king, descended from the legendary Harald Fairhair, the first ruler to unite Norway. But that legacy brought as much danger as it did prestige. When Olaf was still an infant, his father was betrayed and murdered by a rival clan. His mother, Astrid, fled with the child, hoping to save his life from the same fate. The journey that followed was one of terror and hardship. Pursued across forests and seas, Astrid carried her son into hiding, only to be captured by Estonian raiders. The young prince was torn from his mother's arms and sold into slavery in the Baltic lands. Imagine it, a boy born of royal blood, now scrubbing floors and tending the horses of foreign masters. 4 years, Olaf endured captivity, not as a prince, but as property. The sagas describe him as fierce and proud even then, a child who refused to bow easily. That spark, that unbreakable pride, would later define the man he became. Fate, however, had not forgotten him. One day, a wandering merchant recognized the boy's resemblance to the Norwegian royal line and ransomed him from his captors. From there, Olaf's path led across the courts and battlefields of the Viking world. He trained among warriors, learned the art of the sea, and earned his first sword scars in the service of foreign kings. He fought alongside Slavs and Danes, raided in England and Ireland, and gained a reputation for both courage and cunning. The sagas paint him as charismatic and fearless, a man who could turn enemies into allies and allies into zealots. In England, Olaf encountered a world utterly unlike his own. The monasteries he once raided now introduced him to the power of a new faith, Christianity. Whether his conversion was born of conviction or strategy is uncertain, but it became central to his destiny. When he was baptized, he was told that he was chosen by God to bring the light of Christ to the dark lands of the north. The idea consumed him. To Olaf, it was not just religion, it was destiny. The old gods had failed his family, but the new God promised him redemption and empire. Returning to Scandinavia in his 20s, Olaf found his homeland fractured. Norway had splintered into competing jarldoms, pagan warlords ruling through blood feuds and vengeance. The throne of his ancestors lay empty, waiting for a man bold enough to claim it. Olaf seized the moment. With a fleet of longships and the blessing of powerful allies, including the Christian King of England, he landed on Norway's shores like a storm. The sagas describe his arrival as a mix of awe and terror. Villages surrendered before his army reached their gates. Those who resisted were crushed, and those who submitted were baptized, sometimes willingly, sometimes at sword point. In towns like Nidaros and Viking, wooden idols of Odin and Thor were dragged down and burned. Priests of the old faith were drowned in rivers as their temples went up in flames. Olaf's conversion campaign was not gentle, but it was effective. Within a few years, he had broken the back of pagan resistance and proclaimed himself king of all Norway. To his supporters, he was a hero, a warrior saint who had brought unity and order to a land long divided. To his enemies, he was a tyrant and destroyer, a man who replaced one faith with another through fear. Both were true. Olaf's rule burned as brightly as it did briefly. He built churches where temples once stood and demanded that his nobles kneel before the cross. He married the daughter of a Polish duke to strengthen his political ties and envisioned a Christian Norway that would stand proudly among the kingdoms of Europe. Yet the very fire that lifted him up began to consume him. Olaf's certainty in his divine mission made him incapable of compromise. He treated defiance not as rebellion but as sin. Those who questioned him were punished harshly, and even old allies began to whisper against him. The Vikings who had followed him for plunder now bristled under his new laws and moral strictness. The jarls who once feared him began to plot his undoing. As Olaf stood at the height of his power, the seeds of his downfall were already sown. His enemies gathered beyond his borders, men who still worshipped the old gods, and kings who resented Norway's rising influence. The conversion he saw as a holy victory, others saw as betrayal. The flame of ambition that once guided Olaf now cast long shadows. He had forged a kingdom out of chaos, but in doing so, he had made enemies on every shore. His fate, like that of so many conquerors, would not be decided by faith alone, but by blood and steel. The same sea that had carried him home would soon carry his doom. As the tides turned against him, Olaf believed that he was still favored by heaven. But the gods, both old and new, had other plans. The years that followed saw Norway caught between uneasy peace and silent rebellion. Olaf Tryggvason ruled from his court at Nidaros with the iron conviction of a man who believed himself chosen by heaven, yet beyond his throne the storm clouds gathered. His campaign to Christianize Norway had brought unity through fear, conversions by fire, forced baptisms, and the ruthless destruction of pagan shrines. For every chieftain who knelt to the cross, another seethed in secret, waiting for the moment to strike. The very kings and jarls who once pledged loyalty to Olaf now whispered his downfall across the North Sea. Among them was Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark, cunning, calculating, and patient. Sweyn had once been Olaf's ally and baptismal sponsor, but alliance in the Viking world was as fragile as ice in spring. Olaf's growing influence in Norway and his raids on Danish interests made Sweyn uneasy. The Danish king had fought long to carve out dominance in Scandinavia, and the rise of a zealous Norwegian monarch threatened to eclipse his power. Sweyn began weaving alliances against Olaf, drawing in other rulers who had reason to hate the self-proclaimed Christian king. To the east, Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden also bore a grudge. Though himself a Christian, he resented Olaf's arrogance and the way the Norwegian king dismissed Swedish claims along their shared frontier. Olaf's marriage politics had further enraged both kings. He had once been betrothed to Sweyn's sister, only to break the arrangement and marry another woman, Geira, for political advantage. When Geira died, he married again, this time to Tyra, Sweyn's other sister, without the Danish king's consent. To Sweyn, it was not just an insult but a direct challenge to his honor. Tyra fled Denmark, taking refuge with Olaf, and her brother vowed vengeance. In the north, family insults were often settled with fire and blood. But the greatest threat to Olaf did not come from foreign kings alone. Within his own realm, old loyalties began to fracture. The powerful Jarl Erik Håkonsson, son of the pagan lord Olaf, had deposed, plotted revenge from his base in Trøndelag. Erik was a seasoned warrior, pragmatic and patient, with deep ties to both Denmark and Sweden. He and his brother, Jarl Sven, had long awaited the chance to reclaim their family's honor. Olaf's harsh rule, his confiscation of lands, and his unyielding demand for conversion had turned even Christian nobles against him. To many he had ceased to be a king and become a tyrant cloaked in piety. The political map of Scandinavia began to shift like ice breaking apart in spring thaw. Denmark, Sweden, and the exiled Norwegian jarls found common cause in one goal: Olaf Tryggvason must die. Their messengers traveled across the sea, forging an alliance that combined power, vengeance, and religion in equal measure. Each had his reason: Sweyn's for pride, Olaf's for insult, Erik's for blood. Together, they planned a strike that would end the Norwegians' rule once and for all. The sagas tell us that word of this conspiracy reached Olaf in fragments. Some of his spies warned him that enemies gathered to the south. Others whispered that fleets were being built in secret harbors. But Olaf dismissed many of these warnings, confident that no coalition could defeat him. "If all the kings of the north sail against me," he is said to have boasted, "I will still stand as long as God wills it." It was not just pride, it was faith turned to blindness. Meanwhile, the cultural divide Olaf had tried to erase began to reopen. Christianity was still new and fragile in Norway, and many of his people clung to the old gods in secret. In small valleys and along lonely fjords, offerings to Thor and Frey continued under moonlight. To those believers, Olaf was not a savior but a blasphemer who had offended the gods themselves. Tales spread that the old gods were angry, that bad harvests and storms were punishment for the king's arrogance. In pagan songs, he became a symbol of hubris, a man who thought he could outwit the divine. This tension between heaven and the old pantheon made Olaf's position even more precarious. Every act of defiance was framed not as rebellion against a king but as vengeance for Odin and Thor. The battle for power had become a holy war, and Olaf stood at the center of it, certain that righteousness would protect him. Yet in the north, faith had never shielded any man from a blade. As his enemies' fleets prepared in secret, Olaf turned his focus inward, perhaps sensing that something was coming but refusing to retreat. He fortified his ships, trained his men, and prayed more fervently than ever. The sagas describe him spending nights in fasting and silence, as if awaiting a divine sign. Some accounts suggest that even his followers began to waver, torn between loyalty to their king and fear of what was to come. By the late summer of the year 1000, Word reached Olaf that Danish and Swedish ships were sighted near the island of Svolder, somewhere in the Baltic. Reports conflicted. Some said it was a trade fleet, others a trap. Olaf's advisors urged caution. The king, however, saw it as a test of faith, a chance to prove that no mortal force could defeat the will of God. With confidence bordering on madness, he ordered his ships ready and sailed straight into the unknown. The sea ahead was calm, deceptively so. Behind the fog and islands waited his enemies, Sweyn Forkbeard, Olaf Skotkonung, and Jarl Erik, each eager to carve his vengeance into the legend of the Viking king. Olaf had faced 100 battles before, but this time the fight would not be for land or gold. It would be for memory, for belief, for the soul of a nation torn between gods. And as his longships cut across the silver waters toward Svolder, the horizon itself seemed to darken, as though the sky knew what fate awaited him. The morning sun glimmered on the calm waters of the Baltic as Olaf Tryggvason's fleet sailed toward destiny. His long serpent, the pride of Norway, cut through the mist like a blade. Yet hidden behind the islands of Svolder waited 3 enemies, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, Olaf of Sweden, and Jarl Erik of Norway, biding their time. Olaf, fierce and unyielding, refused to flee when he realized the trap. Better to fall with honor than live in shame, he declared, tightening his grip on his sword. The battle erupted in chaos. The allied fleets encircled him, but Olaf's warriors fought like wolves cornered. One by one, his ships were boarded, his men slaughtered. The long serpent became a floating fortress, arrows and spears raining down as enemies climbed her sides. Olaf struck with unmatched fury, cutting through shields and armor until the deck ran red. But courage could not match numbers. As dusk fell, the dragon ship was sinking beneath the tide. Surrounded, his standard torn, Olaf made his final choice. Rather than yield, he leapt from the stern, sword in hand, into the dark sea. Witnesses claimed he vanished without a sound. Some swore he drowned. Others said a small boat carried him away into the mist. No body was found. The victors stood in silence, realizing they had destroyed not only a man, but a legend. The sea had claimed its king, and Norway was left without its master. The waves closed over the long serpent. The dragon's head sank slowly into the depths, and with it vanished one of the last great Viking kings, a man whose death would echo louder than his reign. When the smoke of Svolder faded, no one could find the body of Olaf Tryggvason. His enemies searched the sea, but the waves gave nothing back. For the Danes and Swedes, it was unsettling, a victory without proof, a death without a corpse. They celebrated, yet unease lingered. To the Norse, an unburied man could not rest. Without a funeral, Olaf's soul would wander forever. Rumors soon spread. Some said he had escaped, rowing into the fog. Others swore he lived as a hermit in the east, waiting to reclaim his throne. His followers whispered that he would one day return, the sea his shroud and the dawn his crown. But the pagans told darker tales, that the gods had taken him for betraying them. Fishermen claimed to see strange lights over Svolder's waters, or heard the beat of oars in the night. The sea, they said, had swallowed him whole. The absence of a funeral gave rise to faith and fear alike. Christians began to see him as a holy figure, taken by God, not slain by men. Pagans saw him as a cursed ghost, forever between worlds. His enemies avoided the battlefield. His allies built secret shrines in his name. In time, Olaf's missing funeral became his greatest legacy. His death could not be proven, and so it never truly came. He became the eternal king, half myth, half martyr. The sea had denied his body to men, but granted his name to legend. And in that silence, a new faith found its first northern saint. Centuries later, the story of Olaf Tryggvason still lingered like sea mist over Norway's shores. The king who vanished without burial became a symbol for the nation's soul, torn between the gods of its past and the faith of its future. Though his enemies divided his realm, they could not divide his legend. In time, Christianity triumphed across Norway, fulfilling the mission Olaf began with fire and sword. Chroniclers turned him into a saintly figure, a warrior chosen by God who disappeared not in defeat but in divine ascent. To them, his leap into the sea was not surrender, it was ascension. Others, however, remembered the terror of his conversions, the temples burned, the blood spilled. They saw not a saint, but a zealot. Yet even they could not deny his power. He had changed his world completely. The Heimskringla and later sagas reimagined him as the bridge between two ages. His missing funeral became the perfect metaphor, a soul caught between Valhalla and heaven, never at rest, always remembered. The pyre that never burned became the eternal flame of memory. Even now, the sea where he vanished remains sacred to sailors. Some whisper prayers to him before storms, others swear his ship still sails beneath the waves. Perhaps that is fitting, for kings who reshape their world seldom rest within it. As the story fades to the horizon, only one truth remains. Olaf Tryggvason's body was lost, but his legend endured. The king denied his funeral was granted something far greater, immortality in the hearts and myths of his people.